Well, hello and welcome to Netchuk Arts. And today's story, the story of the world's greatest rock and roll punk rock album cover ever, and me. Let's get to it, shall we? This is the album cover from London Calling by The Clash. Of course, you know it, right? It's been named one of the greatest album covers ever, period. It keeps popping up in stories and lists of the greatest album covers ever. So let's get a little bit of background about this storied album cover. The original photo comes from a show that The Clash was playing at the New York City Palladium back in 1979. The photographer, Penny Smith, caught the photo just quite by accident almost, and didn't even like her original image. She thought it was too blurry, but it went on to become legend. The photo image itself is Paul Simonon. I'm so sorry that I never really caught on to how to pronounce his name. It's a little bit like Rick Ocasek. I don't know. Paul Simonon, the bass player for the Clash. This is him, and the reason that photo, that moment came to pass is because the Clash were playing that show at the New York Palladium, and Paul said even though the show went on well enough, he thought he had a particularly bad night of playing. And at the end of the show, he crashed his bass on the stage floor out of frustration. Penny caught the photo, and a legendary album cover was born. Now, a little bit more about the cover design before we get into what's happening with me. A little bit more about the album cover design is this. Originally, it reads London Calling with a shot of the Clash in concert. And this album cover was a riff off of another album cover earlier, Elvis Presley's debut album. Elvis had Elvis Presley with a photo of him on stage in concert, playing live and holding an acoustic guitar in a very energetic way of playing, like this kind of pose. And the guy that designed the album cover had that album cover. He had picked up that album, that Elvis cover. He had picked up that Elvis cover, that Elvis album, and was influenced by that cover, and was thinking about how Elvis brought on a big change in the American music scene, and was inspired to use the same kind of colors and overall composition that the Elvis people used. And so that's how that original album cover came to be. So there's the background about the original Clash cover. Now, where does little me come into the picture? When I was in art school, the Clash were a huge band to me. They were my favorite band. They couldn't put out enough music for me, and I couldn't play it long enough. I couldn't play it often enough or loud enough, because I just absolutely loved the Clash as a band. Now, one particular personal connection that I felt with the Clash was, that song "Stay Free." That was on the "Give 'Em Enough Rope" album. I always loved that song, and part of it is because of some connections of what the song is about that I connect to my personal life, but also because of the particular line where Mick Jones sings that they met in art school. And I was an art student at the time. And so I make this, I make this crazy connection. Like, wow, they were art school students too, And as a matter of fact, back in those days, a lot of bands that came out of the punk scene were ex-art students themselves. And so I felt that kinship, and I was very much into that kind of music. So when I was working, doing art, creating art, I was always listening to music in the background in my studio as I worked. As I mentioned, The Clash being one of my favorite bands, they were the soundtrack to that early artwork that I was producing. I took it upon myself to, just as a side project, just a personal little thing, to customize my copy of London Calling. And as you can see, what I did was I replaced London with Picasso Calling, and I replaced Paul's bass with a paintbrush. So, why? A couple of reasons. Picasso is an art hero to me because he rewrote the book on painting, just created entire schools of painting, entirely new disciplines came because of Picasso. The guy broke through walls, built new walls, and then knocked those down. Art hero, Picasso. Now, when I was in art school, painting, more or less, was considered a dead art. Yeah. You know what was big in those days? Conceptual art. Everybody, all the art students around me, I'm telling you, like 75, 80% of the art students around me were working on conceptual art. All right. They would take a human hair and stick it on at the end of a toothpick and put it on a base and then, title it the irony of man. Hey, go to it, and then talk in a half-hour critique about what it was all about. I just wanted to paint. Painting was dead, and I actually took it as a challenge to bring it back up, to recreate it, as you will, in my own humble way, in my own humble little circle of the art world. So I was one of the few painters that were around. Now, one more point about why I did what I did to the album. The Clash influenced my work. They were my soundtrack in the studio. Picasso influenced my work because he recreated and resurrected painting several times over. And one thing that I wanted to do as an artist was, in my own fashion of what I saw as resurrecting painting, was the paintbrush, the connection here. I mentioned previously in another video that I don't use brushes when I paint. I use my hands. And that came right from very early. I mean, maybe my first year or so in art school, I used the brush like all the other students. But man, to me, that brush was a third party, that third wheel that was unwelcome, unnecessary, and created a barrier between the artist and the art. And so I lost that paintbrush. Symbolically, I smashed the paintbrush like Paul smashed his bass guitar. I smashed the paintbrush and moved to creating art with my hands. A direct connection between the artist and the art. So there would only be that truth, and the communication wouldn't be lost, in translation between an artist and a paintbrush. Thinking too deeply? Now, how conceptual is that, right? I made fun of the conceptual artists, but I took a piece of what they were thinking about. And to me, the concept of the paintbrush as a third party was something I could do without. And so, as a reflection on this, and a motivation to myself, hence my custom Picasso Calling album cover was born. It still lives today from my old days of art school, carrying on even today, just like the Clash's music. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for joining me on this little personal story. I appreciate you joining me. Please like, subscribe, and so on. And I'll see you next time on Netchook Arts. Peace.